2019 October Reagan Ranch High School Conference. Please join me in welcoming Liz Wheeler.
Thank you so much for having me. Although I have to say I did not like the shout out to my age. It's a new thing, not a fan. All right, guys, you having a good weekend? Did you have a good conference? All right, good. All right, my name is Liz Wheeler. I host the show Tipping Point on One American News Network. I hope that you have seen it before. This, however, is one of my favorite things to do, to come up here to the Reagan Center and talk to y'all, because you guys listen and you care about what our country stands for enough to show up here and fight for it. So even though you've spent the whole weekend listening to other people talk and listening to what other people say, I want you to know that we all care about what you have to say, and we care about what you think of our country. So thank you for that. Okay, you could have clapped there for yourselves, but that's okay. Okay, so today we're going to talk about climate change. Climate change. Did you guys see that video that went around on Twitter of the guy twerking at the climate strike? Did you see that? Yeah, unfortunately, we all did. Twerking and booty dropping while someone threw glitter on him to save the planet, dropping into the splits. I heard, actually, that the reason that he did that, it's a rather unorthodox way to fight climate change. I heard that he did that because somebody told him that politicians weren't twerking hard enough to find a fix to climate change. My sister is 16, told me not to make that joke because it's embarrassing, but I thought it was funny. Okay, so I'm here today to deliver a hard truth to that man and to many other people. Twerking will not solve climate change. In fact, I'm here today to talk about Greta Thunberg and a whole generation of kids, your generation of Americans, who have been told lies about climate change. So first of all, what I want to do is, how many of you in this room, by a show of hands, how many of you believe in climate change? So that's a trick question. That's a trick question. This is a question that the left uses as a rhetorical trick. We've talked about this before. So anybody who's been to one of these YAF conferences might recognize this. It is called the binary choice tactic. Do y'all remember hearing about that? The binary choice tactic is a trick that the left uses. They ask you a question in a way that gives you only two options. Option number one is you adhere to their radical leftist ideology, meaning you agree with them, or the only alternative is that you're a bad person. They don't want to give you any other options, just that binary choice tactic. Either you agree with them or you're a bad person. In this case, that question, do you believe in climate change, is a binary choice question, because they want you to either agree with their solution, their political solution to climate change, or they want to paint you as a science denier. So when they talk about climate change, don't mistake it for the fluctuating temperatures. They're talking about their Green New Deal political version of climate change. Okay, so I'm here to tell you today, you don't have to choose one of those two binary options. You could acknowledge a problem with polluting in our oceans. Plastic in our ocean is a problem. You don't have to deny that. You can advocate for responsible deforestation. You can support market-driven innovation for renewable energy, and you can acknowledge the historical trends of fluctuating temperatures. You can also advocate for responsible stewardship of God's creation, all without buying into the liberal climate twerking crap. So today, I want to give you 10 reasons not to believe the climate change criers. Because at least for me, when you hear these talking points or these narratives that come from the left about the climate, it's not the easiest topic to debunk, because a lot of times they hide it either in rhetorical tricks like the binary choice tactic, or they hide it in pseudo-scientific facts that you might not know how to debunk off the top of your head. So what I want to do today is I want to give you 10 reasons not to believe what they say, or 10 reasons to question what they say. The number one reason not to believe what these doomsdayers say is because their predictions never come true. They tell us that if we don't do something, if we don't pass the Green New Deal, that our Earth is going to die in 12 years. Life will cease to exist as we know it. But they've been saying this for 40 years. They've been making these doomsday predictions since before you and I were born. In fact, they predicted by the year 2000 that all the polar ice caps would be melted, and they're not. They predicted that 50 million climate refugees from Pacific Islands would be flooding the West by now, and they're not. These same people, and I'm not just talking about politicians, these are scientists from NASA, from NOAA. These are scientists from the United Nations. These are high-level people in this movement. They've predicted that California would be flooded with inland seas by now. You guys can check what you're sitting on right now, but I'm pretty sure you're sitting on chairs. You're not sitting in rowboats. So that is another prediction that hasn't come true, and you can go on and on. They said the Netherlands would be uninhabitable by now. They said the Himalayan glaciers would be on the road to being fully melted. They said the Arctic would no longer enjoy ice. Children wouldn't know what snow is. These are all predictions made by climate change scientists, propagated by reputable or formerly reputable news networks, and none of these predictions came true. So now we're told, well, no matter about that, no matter that the credibility of these doomsday sayers, these predictors, no matter that, we should listen to them when they predict that our world is going to end in 12 years now. And my question is, if they've gotten every single thing wrong in the past, why would we believe them now? So that's reason number one. And it actually brings us to reason number two, why you shouldn't believe climate change criers. They have a rule. No questions allowed. You're not allowed to ask what I just asked. You're not allowed to say, well, how come this prediction is accurate if none of your other predictions have ever been accurate? You're not allowed to question Al Gore or AOC or Greta Thunberg. Not at all. You have to believe and not ask questions. And that brings us to the third reason why you shouldn't believe climate change deniers, because they try to destroy skeptics. They don't just not want you to ask questions. If you do ask questions, they try to destroy you. And this is how we know that it's not based on science. Because everyone's taken a basic biology class, right? Everyone's taken a basic science class, and you know that the basis of science, the scientific method, is based on skepticism. You ask questions. Something's not a scientific fact or a scientific law unless it can't be disproven. If it can't be disproven, then you know a whole lot of people have tried to prove it wrong. Those people were skeptics. But in the climate change world, you're not allowed to do that, which means it's not really based on science. The other part of this, the other part of the destruction of climate skeptics, is they tell you that 97% of climate change scientists are in consensus, right? You guys have heard that statistic, right? The majority, the consensus, 97% of scientists agree. So there's a couple reasons why that's wrong. First of all, consensus does not equal being right. At one point in history, the greatest scientific minds were in consensus that the Earth was flat. That wasn't right, but they all agreed on it. So consensus does not equal something being right. And then the factoid, about 97% of scientists agree. Do you know how that statistic came to be? Do you know what that's based on? No, you probably don't. Not very many people do. And not very many people ask, what is that based on? So I'm going to tell you, it's based on a group of citizen scientists. They did a study. Do you know what a citizen scientist is? An activist who doesn't want to seem political. Citizen scientists, it's a group of activists who got together and they claimed that they analyzed over 11,000, I think it's 11,900 scientific papers on climate change, on the human contribution to climate change. And they analyzed these papers and came to the conclusion that 97% of the scientists who published these papers were in agreement. But do you know how they analyzed these papers? They did a Google search within this scientific database just for the words climate change and human-involved climate change. And then they didn't read what the viewpoint of the scientist was. They just assumed that those words meant that that scientist agreed that humans are the largest contributing factor to climate change. And so they published this statistic, which has become one of the most commonly repeated statistics about climate change, and it's simply not true. A group of actual scientists got together and analyzed those 11,944 papers, and do you want to know what percent of those papers actually support the original contention that humans were the majority driving factor behind climate change? Not 97%, 0.3%. But you won't hear that. You don't hear that because the climate change criers don't want to talk about it. They don't want to answer your questions, and maybe it's easy to see why. Because when you do ask the questions, you find fatal flaws. So that brings us to reason number 4 why you shouldn't believe the climate criers. When there is something that they get wrong, when there is science that's not really science, it's pseudoscience, when they make a mistake that impacts a large prediction, they cover it up. Do you guys know what NOAA is? The National Oceanic? Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure what the acronym is, but I am familiar with it.
Okay, NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. It's a government-funded agency. It's basically government-funded meteorology and climate studies, okay? NOAA, a government agency, they're known within the scientific community for fudging numbers. And I want to give you an example of this. In 2016, NOAA claimed that year, 2016, was one of the hottest years on record. You've heard that claim, I'm sure, right? That we're experiencing the hottest years on record? That's not true. It's not true at all. In fact, 2016, the percentage of hot days in 2016 was below average. Do you know what it ranked? 80th since 1985. The percentage of hot days in the year 2016 was only 80th on the list of the years with the highest number of hot days since 1895. And they cover this up. They make this claim and they cover up the real data. How do they cover it up? Well, they adjusted their own reporting. They didn't use actual numbers, they used conjecture, not actual data they collected. They adjusted their reported temperature to match almost identically with CO2 in the atmosphere. So it wasn't based on numbers that they'd measured and then transcribed and then put into a graph and then analyzed to see if it was the hottest day. They made it up. They made it up to match their political agenda. So in other words, maybe they don't know what they're talking about when it comes to the data. And if they don't know what they're talking about when it comes to the data, then who are they to make these claims, these prophecies, and then to give these prophecies to politicians who want to convert that into political policy? And so that brings us to the 5th reason not to believe the climate change criers. The 5th reason has to do with the politicians here. The politicians don't even know what they believe exactly. And we're going to use AOC as an example here. AOC, you've heard her say this, I'm sure. AOC has said we only have 12 years left until we're past the point of no return if we don't do something. Have you guys heard her say that? Okay, so that's very strange then, that after she said that in a very serious way, that she then tweeted, and this is a quote here, "You would have to have the social intelligence of a sea sponge to think that that claim is literal." But when she said it, it sounded literal. But she says when the GOP makes fun of her, quote, "The GOP is basically Dwight from The Office, so who knows?" Well, is the claim real or is the claim not real? Because if it's not literal, then that would change how we reacted to it, wouldn't it? The politicians don't know the truth either. So that brings us to reason number 6, you shouldn't believe the climate criers because of the people who they make their spokespeople. They hide behind a child. Did you guys see the video of Greta Thunberg? How dare you? You've stolen my dreams, my childhood. You saw that? Well, here's the conundrum. And I'm not here to make fun of her as a person. I feel bad for her because I think she's being exploited. But here's the conundrum. If Democrats tell us that we can't have an opinion on climate change because we're not the scientists, and the scientists are all in consensus, if we're not allowed to talk about climate change because we're not scientists, how come their primary spokesperson on the international stage is not a scientist but a 16-year-old child? Do you guys know the answer to that? because they use the child as a rhetorical human shield. They conflate bullying of a child and criticism of the political ideology she's espousing. So if you criticize what she says, if you criticize the fact that she wants to cut fossil fuel use and carbon emissions in half or more, then you're bullying a child. That's what the left will tell you. And so they exploit children. They use children as spokespeople so that they can accuse anybody who asks a question of being mean to that child. You should immediately be skeptical of any political organization whose primary spokesperson is a child. And that brings us to the other leaders. The other leaders of this movement, AOC and Al Gore. Did I mention the financial benefit to these leaders? The hypocrisy here. Al Gore, the benefits that he has enjoyed on his global doomsday tours, his $1 million homes, his fleet of gas-guzzling SUVs, these apparently, for you and me, these are climate sins. But for the leaders of this movement, the people who are telling us that we should sacrifice our freedom to the government so that the government can fix this problem, it's okay if they commit these same climate sins. That should immediately make you skeptical as well. But that's part of the problem, and this is reason number 8 not to believe the climate change criers. They tell us that only government, not individuals, not the free market, only government can fix the problem. Can anybody here name one problem that only government can fix? Is there anything the government has done that they have done better than the private sector ever in the course of the history of our country? I can't think of a single thing. Not one single thing. So why would we trust government to this? Why would we trust this to government? Because this is part of their plan. This is part of what they want from climate change. They're using climate change as a medium to get to their political goal. And that brings me, that brings me to reason number 9. Did you ever notice that all of the solutions to climate change, all of the ways that we have to act, the some things that we have to do conveniently, are all political policies that the left has wanted for many, many years? And I'm not talking about just policies that address climate change. I'm talking about what you see when you open up the Green New Deal. What do you see? Government-run healthcare. That's what you see. Universal basic income. That's what you see. Minimum wage hikes. That's what you see. Penalties, if not a ban, on eating meat and traveling by airplane. These are all things. Higher taxes, job guarantees. What on earth do those things have to do with climate change and fluctuating temperatures? It's very, very convenient. If you look at the solutions to climate change, it's very convenient that all of the solutions the Democrats want politically are political policies that they have wanted for a very long time. And that brings us to reason number 10 to be skeptical of the climate change criers. What would happen in our nation if we accepted their premise? What would our country look like 10 years down the road if we said, okay, we believe your premise, we believe that the world will end in 12 years if we don't pass the Green New Deal, and therefore we agree to pass the Green New Deal. What would happen in our nation? It's not rhetorical. Shout it out. What would happen? Poverty, socialism, doom. Whoever said doom, that's a great word. The Democrats want a carbon-neutral society. They want to eliminate all fossil fuels. They want to ban nuclear power too, which would leave us entirely dependent on wind and solar power. But without backup generators, relying on fossil fuels or nuclear power, what happens if it's not windy or it's not sunny? What happens to the people who depend on electricity, not just in their day-to-day life for convenience, but what happens to hospitals? What happens when we're not able to rely on wind power or solar power? The same with electric cars. Electric cars require the mining of elements from sweet Mama Earth. And somehow the Democrats bypass that and don't care about that when they're advocating for us to give up our cars and only take mass transportation. And this is where it betrays itself. It betrays itself and becomes more like a cult than a science. If all of the climate hysteria is in the interest of saving the people by saving the planet, then how come the so-called solution to all of this is socialism? Because we know what happens to countries that implement socialism, don't we? We don't even have to look to history. We don't have to look to Cuba and their communism. We don't have to look to the Soviet Union. We can look at Venezuela right now. We know what happens when a nation is socialist. We've seen this throughout history. So if the left actually cared about humankind, mankind, why would their solution entail imposing the suffering of socialism on hundreds of millions of people? That should be the question that we ask these people. Because make no mistake, that's what would happen. They tell us, Greta Thunberg tells us that we're on the precipice of a mass starvation event. But that's what would happen, too, if we implemented the Green New Deal, if we allowed socialism to encroach on our nation. We would see that same poverty, that same destitution, that same oppression that would lead to mass starvation. And I'm not being hyperbolic here, because we can look in history and we can see that happening down in Venezuela. We've seen the videos of people in the Soviet Union eating shoes because they could not get a loaf of bread. We've seen this happen here before. And if you look at the Green New Deal, if you look at Greta Thunberg's plan, you can open it up and you'll find that that's what it is. It's socialism in the name of saving the planet from climate change. So then we get to the political aspect of this. We ask ourselves, why have they staged this elaborate lie? If that's what this is, if we're able to go through the narrative on climate change and debunk it, as we've done in short form tonight, why stage this elaborate lie? And the answer to this is because only a tiny, marginal fraction of Americans want socialism in our nation. But the Democrats, the elected officials, the politicians, they want socialism. So they stage this lie to serve as a conduit to usher socialism into America without the voters' consent. And they do this through this process. They fearmonger first. They tell us that young people won't be able to have children because our children will have no future. They tell us the world is going to end. They create this fear in us because fear creates urgency. It makes us want to act. Once people are scared and believe the warning, they want to act. And then they tell us the private sector has had 30, 40, 50 years, maybe even 100 years to solve this problem. And the private sector, they tell us, has failed. So the only option is for us to turn to the government. Only government can fix the problem. And once the people believe this, because we've been indoctrinated, feel the fear because we want to be able to have children and we don't want the world to end, once we feel that urgency to do something, and once we've been convinced that the only way that we can fix this is through the government because the private sector has failed, then Democrats give us Greta Thunberg and AOC and Al Gore. They give us a bill like the Green New Deal and they say it fights climate change, but it actually ushers in communism. And so I'm here to tell you, your generation specifically today, do not fall for this. Do not fall for this. All of this is based on a doctrine contradicted by both science and history, invented out of thin air as a method to control behavior, coming at you in the form of a Green New Deal that regulates your behavior, your choices, and your life on everything, from using plastic straws to eating cheeseburgers to buying an airline ticket to visit your family or come to this conference, forcing you and your parents to tear down your house, give your money to other people, and fundamentally undermining the economy in our nation to the point where you won't even be allowed to own a car anymore, and the government will own everything and control everyone, and you and I will be left without the basic modern necessities to survive and thrive in America. If that sounds scary, it's because it is scary. It's not something we can't fight against, but it's not something that we can pretend is real and go along with, because this is a strategy the Democrats have been putting into play for years and years, and it is only now, forgive the pun, coming to a tipping point, and it's up to our generation to stop it. And now you know the 10 reasons, main reasons, why it's a scam. Thank you.